My name is Tiffany Brooks, I'm 28, and I remember vividly how it felt, like I'd been standing in the background my whole life, in the shadows, unimportant, existing just long enough to run errands and hold the family together, but never long enough to be a source of pride. My brother, Kevin, was their golden child, the darling they spoke of with admiration and a twinkle in their eye, his career as a lawyer the pinnacle of success, his every word, his every victory greeted with pats on the back and dazzling smiles, and instead of building my own life, I'd been crushing my dreams bit by bit, adapting, taking on the burden, thinking that if I was the family's caretaker, if I sacrificed myself, I'd one day hear the same words of approval they so generously bestowed upon him. But that moment never came. All that remained were cold stares, chest-tightening words, and the eternal comparison. Why can't you be more like him? These phrases felt like blows, and I swallowed them silently, trying to convince myself that patience would eventually pay off. As my brother's wedding approached, the responsibility for the preparations fell upon me, as if I were obligated to be that invisible cog in the machine once again. I thought through every detail, the menu, the decorations, the music, the guest list, everything, down to the last detail, had to sparkle with perfection, and I, naive, once again believed that maybe now they would notice that I could be significant, that I was capable of something more than just silently obeying, but I was wrong. The night before the wedding, we sat at the dining room table, and the air was so heavy it was difficult to breathe. Kevin, with his eternal self-confidence, demanded the impossible from me: more expensive rings, rare imported flowers, other details that might enhance the photographs but completely ruin me. I exhaled and said no, allowing myself that word for the first time, setting a boundary for the first time. And then something happened I wasn't prepared for. My parents lost their temper. Their voices turned into whips, and the most terrifying thing came from my father's lips: "The best wedding gift for your brother is your disappearance from our family forever." Silence fell over the room, as if everything around me had frozen. Even the air became sharper and colder, my breath caught in my throat, my heart pounded like crazy. But I didn't beg. I stood up, grabbed my keys, and walked out, feeling the door close behind me, as if it wasn't just the click of a lock, but a seal that sealed an entire life. The wedding day arrived, and everything seemed perfect: laughter, music, guests, white tablecloths, and smiles. But I knew that everything inside me had already collapsed, and then, in an instant, everything around me changed. And I ask myself a question that still haunts me: if you were in my shoes, would you have stayed and witnessed what was happening, or would you have left forever, never looking back? I'd love to hear your answer, because sometimes it's someone else's opinion that helps you see your own life more clearly. After all, many years ago, I went through a similar dilemma. When I was a young freelance marketer with bold plans and hopes of making a name for myself in this ruthless industry, I signed a $40,000 contract with a major supermarket chain. It was my first big win, my chance at freedom and independence, my ticket to the future I'd long envisioned. But almost immediately, disaster struck. The family-owned grocery store in Erie, Pennsylvania, was on the brink of bankruptcy. The bills were mounting, suppliers had stopped calling, debts were sinking, and I heard my mother's voice on the phone, trembling and pleading for help, while my father, usually stoic and reserved, admitted for the first time that they could lose everything, and I couldn't turn away. I canceled the contract, dialed the supermarket representative, and, swallowing back tears, told them I couldn't continue. Instead, I threw everything I had into saving our store. I spent nights at my desk, crafting a marketing strategy from scratch, putting up posters, stuffing flyers into mailboxes, and launching the first social media posts. Still clumsy, but offering at least a sliver of hope. I called suppliers, negotiated deals, retained customers with charm and persistence, cut expenses, and devised promotions to revive the store. And after a few months, it paid off. Customer traffic doubled, revenue soared, and the worst debts were paid off. I worked myself to the point of exhaustion, believing that this would be the key to recognition for me, that they would finally look at me and say, "We are proud of you," but it didn't happen. Instead of gratitude, one evening, Mom, Joyce, and Dad, Jeffrey, held a family meeting. I arrived expecting at least a nod, but what I heard was something completely different. They announced that Kevin was taking over the store. He's a lawyer, Mom said, her eyes shining, as if that automatically made him more competent. He'll be smart enough to handle it. Kevin, who hadn't lifted a finger this whole time, sat with a smug grin, straightening his tie, and already envisioned himself as the boss. Dad nodded, avoiding my gaze, and said, "It's for the best." I stood before them, stunned, a lump in my throat, my heart so heavy it felt like it couldn't beat anymore, and I realized, my sacrifices had once again been nullified, and my work had once again been appropriated. "Did you do well, Tiffany?" He said these words with such a condescending tone, as if I were a schoolgirl barely managing her homework, and not a woman who spent nights torturing herself to keep their business from sinking completely. I sat across from him, rage seething inside, but on the outside, I looked calm again. Yes, I had saved their legacy. I had erased my dreams so that they could keep the store, so that the Brooks name would sound not like a bankrupt disgrace, but a small story of survival. But to them, I was just a backup, the kind of person who shows up only when the real star is busy in their own shining world and someone needs to fill the gaps. Mom kept praising Kevin's vision, repeating how smart he was, how strategic he was, as if these phrases weren't knives stabbing me in the chest again and again. My father didn't even look up from his coffee cup, as if nothing I'd done concerned him. I wanted to scream right there at the table, to hurl at them all the words that had been piling up for years. "Look at me. I saved you. I'm the one who pulled you out of the abyss." But I simply swallowed my resentment, forced myself to plaster on a smile that was bursting at the seams, and moved on, because I was so used to living, silently, working, and hoping that one day they would finally notice. Late at night, I rearranged shelves in the store, updated ads, made sure every promotion looked appealing, and convinced myself that if I worked even harder, if I put even more effort into it, then maybe one day at family dinner, Mom would say, "You saved us," and Dad would finally pat me on the shoulder, like he always did with Kevin, my best friend since college. Nathan Todd saw right through it. We'd meet at the little diner on the corner, and he'd shake his head and twist his lips into a sad smile as he listened to my stories of my eternal quest for parental approval. "They're blind, Tiffany," he said one day, setting down his coffee mug. "You're killing yourself for people who don't care." I brushed it off, pretending not to pay attention, but his words lingered deep inside, and every time I worked nights for them again, I heard his voice like an echo in my head, and yet I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop hoping. I couldn't accept the idea that my parents would never see value in me. The store thrived thanks to my campaign. The shelves emptied faster than I could refill them, the cash registers rang incessantly, the suppliers started smiling at me again and offering me favorable terms, but every time I opened the door and saw Kevin's nameplate on the office, my heart sank. My parents discussed strategy with him on the phone, as if he'd been the one raising the store from the ashes, while I was left carrying boxes and making sure the refrigerators were always stocked with milk. "Good job," my mother said absent-mindedly one day, passing by, as if I'd just mopped the floor rather than led a campaign that saved the business. Kevin, as always, burst forth with ideas I'd long ago implemented, but he delivered them loudly, emphatically, and my parents nodded immediately, as if they were his brilliant discoveries. I caught myself waiting. At least this time they'd say thank you, I thought. Maybe if I do more, if I surpass myself, they will finally stop seeing me as just the youngest daughter, the eternal second option. I walked forward, choking with the pain in my chest, but I continued to believe in the mirage of the day when they would say the words I'd waited my whole life: "You've had enough." A few months passed, and I found myself caught up in their scenario again. Kevin was getting married to Lindsay Newman, and my parents, without even asking if I had the energy or money, simply dumped the entire wedding planning on me. I was working part-time as a marketer, barely making ends meet, but I had the nerve to spend $10,000 of my own savings to pay deposits for the venue, vendors, and endless details. I wanted everything to be perfect, but not for Kevin's sake, for the sake of proving to myself and them that I could organize an event that would finally make them appreciate me. Weeks were wasted on calls. I spoke with florists, photographers, negotiated with caterers, double-checked every contract to make sure there were no mistakes. I chose a menu that included roasts, chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, and light summer salads, all delicious, satisfying, and within my limited budget. I met with vendors in Erie, haggled, negotiated discounts, and felt everything starting to come together. But Kevin showed his true colors again. He wasn't content with a wedding, he wanted a show. "Invite a string quartet from Pittsburgh," he said over breakfast, his eyes glued to his phone, and Lindsay had spotted rare orchids in a magazine, and now they, too, had to be on the tables. I explained that the budget was stretched thin, that my savings were nearly depleted, but he rolled his eyes and snapped, "You always cut corners, Tiffany, go for it." Mom, sipping her coffee, backed him up. "He's right, it's his day, don't ruin it." My father sat with his newspaper, nodding without looking up. Those words cut me to the heart again, but I forced myself to stand and continue, because somewhere deep down, I still clung to that childhood hope. Maybe if I did everything perfectly, they would finally look at me the way they always looked at him. I worked late, sat in front of the screen, sending emails to suppliers and tweaking every detail of the plans, checking estimates, deadlines, details, and even when my eyes were drooping with fatigue, I still forced myself to finish writing the next email, because I knew a new wave of demands awaited me tomorrow. I found a local band who agreed to play for a modest fee, chose standard roses instead of imported ones because they were affordable and within my budget, and every step I took was an attempt to find a happy medium between Kevin's fantasies and reality, but he persisted. One afternoon, he called, sounding irritated and impatient, and declared that I should book a famous DJ from Cleveland, adding matter-of-factly, "It's only a few thousand more." I reminded him that I was covering half the wedding costs out of pocket, that I'd put everything I had into it. He barked, "Get it sorted," and hung up. I stared at the phone for a few more seconds, trying to process what he'd just said, and then noticed my mother. Joyce had overheard our conversation and, sighing, shook her head. "Why can't you just do what he wants?" My father, sitting next to me, looked up and muttered, "Don't screw it up for him," before returning his attention to the newspaper. I felt rejected and small, as if all my efforts were a waste. No one noticed. I'd spent hours and days coordinating vendors, sacrificing my own projects and work for their wedding, only to be criticized at every step. At dinner, Mom scrutinized a typo in the draft invitation I showed her and coldly remarked, "Careless," tossing it aside as if it were an unacceptable mistake. Kevin chuckled, still staring at his phone, and added, "Typical Tiffany." I wanted to snap back, to tell them the whole truth about how much I was carrying, but I bit my tongue, knowing any word would be used against me. I adjusted the seating chart over and over again, confirmed food delivery, clarified the number of chairs and tablecloths, hoping they would finally see that all this was costing me energy I barely had left. Only Nathan noticed what was happening to me. We met one evening at a coffee shop in Erie, and I slumped in a chair, cupping my hands around my mug, and unleashed a torrent of complaints about Kevin's endless demands. "He wants a customized sculpture now," I said, my voice shaking with exhaustion. Nathan leaned toward me, his eyes serious, his voice firm. "Tiffany, you're bending over backwards for people who don't appreciate you. You need to stand up for yourself." I shrugged, stirring my cold coffee, and whispered, "If I can do this, maybe they'll finally understand." He shook his head, clearly unconvinced. "They won't. You're worth so much more than their approval." His words rang true, but I couldn't allow myself to believe it. I continued to call the banquet hall every day, making sure the tablecloths would be perfectly ironed, that the cake wouldn't be damaged in transit, and even put down an extra deposit so there would be a backup generator in case of power outages. My savings were dwindling, but I kept telling myself it was worth it. If the wedding was flawless, my mother would smile at me for the first time in years, and my father would say something other than his usual. "Don't ruin it." I poured everything I had into this wedding, believing it was my chance to shine, to prove myself worthy of their respect. But Kevin didn't stop. The demands snowballed. At one point, he sent a link to a luxury catering service and said there had to be caviar on the table because it would add status to the evening. I called him and explained that it would ruin the budget, that we were already on the brink, but he replied coldly, "You're embarrassing me," and hung up. Mom, hearing this, only sighed, "Just do what he asked, Tiffany, it's not that hard." Dad, his eyes glued to the TV, nodded. Their detachment tore me apart, but I still pressed on, adjusting plans, correcting mistakes, making arrangements, because deep down I held the hope that maybe the wedding would change their attitude toward me. And so, on the eve of the celebration, I sat at the family dinner table in Erie. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Mom had cooked her signature roast, but no one had even touched the food. Kevin leaned back in his chair, his finger skimming across his phone. His fiancée Lindsay poked at her plate without looking up, and my father sipped his wine, pretending not to notice the awkward silence. I looked at them all and thought about how months of my life, $10,000 of my savings, and every ounce of my energy had been invested in the wedding that was supposed to take place tomorrow. But that evening, everything felt different, as if clouds were gathering over our heads, and I sensed a storm approaching from which I would have nowhere to hide. I steeled myself, trying to convince myself that this evening would pass peacefully, that at least at dinner at my parents' house there would be no more arguments, that I could simply sit in silence and finish my mother's food, savoring the familiar taste of the roast, and maybe, for a moment, feel part of the family. But Kevin broke the silence so casually, as if he were talking about something insignificant. "Tiffany, we need to update the menu," he said, not even looking up from his phone. His voice indifferent and demanding at the same time. "Add lobster tails and that vintage Napa champagne, oh, and hire that photographer from Pittsburgh who shot the governor's gala." I stared at him, my fork hovering over my plate, as if time had stood still. I knew what that meant: champagne at $500 a bottle, a photographer at $3,000 a day, and all this on top of a budget I'd already maxed out, paying for half their wedding, the deposit for the venue, decorations, music, flowers, everything. "Kevin, I can't," I finally said, trying to keep my voice even. "I've already paid for everything, the venue, the band, the flowers, there's no money left." He chuckled and tossed the phone on the table, looking at me like I was a petulant child. "You're always so stingy, Tiffany, it's my wedding, make it happen." Joyce abruptly set down her glass, her eyes narrowing. "He's right, this is a once-in-a-lifetime day. Why are you so selfish?" Jeffrey looked up, his voice hoarse and tired. "Don't ruin it for your brother." The words cut me more sharply than I could have imagined. I'd given everything, my time, my money, my energy, my nights, and yet they still saw me as a problem, a drag. "Stingy Tiffany," as if my efforts were a waste of time. I tried to explain. "I spent $10,000, that's my own savings, the budget is exhausted, a lobster and a celebrity photographer, it's impossible." Kevin rolled his eyes and, leaning toward Lindsay, said so I could hear, "See, I told you she'd save on us." Lindsay remained silent, avoiding my gaze, as if she wanted to disappear. Joyce crossed her arms, her voice sharp, almost icy. "You've always been like this, Tiffany, never intervening when it mattered." Jeffrey nodded, adding, "Kevin deserves more than your half-hearted efforts." I wanted to stand up and scream, recount all the nights I haggled with the vendors, how I orchestrated every detail to make their dream a reality, how I went above and beyond for them, but I merely clenched my fists, staring at my plate. "I paid for half of this wedding, I did everything you asked. I can't keep pouring money into this I don't have," I said, my voice breaking, not from weakness, but from anger. Kevin smirked, shaking his head as if I were a foolish girl who didn't understand anything. "Then maybe you shouldn't interfere at all." Joyce leaned forward, her gaze icy, each word like a slap. "You know what, Tiffany? The best wedding gift your brother could give me is to disappear from the family forever." The room fell silent, even the clock on the wall ticked more quietly. Jeffrey didn't flinch, just stared at his plate as if I wasn't there. Lindsay shifted awkwardly, wordlessly, her fingers fiddling with her napkin. My heart pounded, their words echoing like a loud slap across the face. Disappear. After everything I'd done, I wanted to scream, to shake them, to tell them about every sacrifice, every dollar, every morning I woke up to call suppliers, every night I sat with a calculator, but their faces, Joyce's gaze, Jeffrey's indifference, and Kevin's smug smirk told me it didn't matter. they'd chosen him again. I rose from my chair, my legs shaking, the creak of wood on the floor cutting through the silence, a sound louder than words. "Okay," I said quietly but firmly, "if that's what you want." I grabbed my purse, the keys jingling in my hand like a small bell that completed something inside me. "Don't make a scene, Tiffany," Joyce called after me, but I wasn't listening anymore. I walked out the door, slamming it behind me. The sharp, final sound hit my ears like a seal. Outside, the cold, icy air hit my face, and I took a deep breath, trying to stop myself from shaking, but inside, I felt a fire, the same one that had been building for years while I endured it. I'd given them everything, my savings, my time, my hope, and they'd thrown it all back at me like I didn't need it. Sitting in the car, I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my thoughts racing. They wanted me to leave, okay, but I wasn't going to disappear quietly. I'd spent months building the perfect day for them, only to be told the problem was me. Enough, I didn't know what to do next, but one thing was clear, I wouldn't be their doormat anymore. I started the engine and heard the smooth roar of the car, and there was something liberating in that sound, as if life itself was urging me to decide not to look back. My resolve grew stronger with every second as I drove through the deserted streets, lit by the cold light of the street lamps. Tomorrow they would see what would happen when I stopped bearing their burden. I knew this moment was inevitable, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no fear, only a bitter resolve. The next morning, I woke early, but I didn't really sleep. I just lay there, replaying their words over and over again, as if they were a record with a stuck needle. Their voices still burned in my ears. "You're selfish, you're a disgrace, the best gift is your disappearance." I sat on the edge of the bed, my bare feet pressing against the cold floor, staring at my phone, where the bank app was open, my savings account, $10,000. Everything I'd saved for years, locked away in deposits for Kevin's wedding, the catering, the florists, the band, even the backup generator. Everything was paid for out of my pocket, to make their day look perfect. But after last night's dinner, after their final verdict, everything changed. I wasn't going to let them walk all over me anymore. Grabbing the phone, I started calling. First, the catering company. "Cancel the order," I said evenly, though inside I was seething. The woman on the line tried to mumble something about penalties and return policies, but I didn't care. "I want my deposit back," I repeated. Then came the call to the florist. "No roses, no arrangements, cancellation, refund my payment." The band was the last one. They had already cashed my check, but I spoke with such confidence that even they agreed to a partial refund. By noon, most of my 10,000 had returned to my account, and the wedding was left empty-handed. No flowers, no music, no food. I felt no guilt, only a calm determination, as if I'd finally taken back what had been stolen from me. They wanted me to leave? I'd give them a wedding they'd never forget. By midday, chaos reigned at the venue. Guests began arriving to find empty tables, devoid of white tablecloths and shiny cutlery, without bouquets or live music. People exchanged glances, whispered, their faces drawn in bewilderment. Kevin, in an expensive suit, his face flushed, stood in the middle of the room, helplessly yelling at the venue staff, who shrugged their shoulders, explaining that there were no orders. Lindsay stood nearby, pale, her eyes brimming with tears, picking at the bouquet of cheap artificial flowers the staff had given her as a courtesy gesture. My phone vibrated nonstop, voicemail after voicemail. Joyce screamed, her shrill voice cutting through the speaker. "Tiffany, what have you done? You've ruined everything." Jeffrey left a message too, but his voice was cold, lifeless. "You're a disgrace to this family." I stared at the screen as new notifications poured in, not calling back. I'd heard enough for a lifetime. That same evening, Kevin, not content with personal accusations, went online, on a local forum, the same one where neighbors discussed recipes and sales. He created a post, "My sister ruined my wedding." His words dripped with venom. "She's jealous, spiteful, and ruined the best day of my life." And the comments poured in. People I'd known for years, neighbors I shared the street with, called me selfish, unstable, ungrateful. Joyce intervened and replied to the thread, "She's always been trouble." Jeffrey didn't reply, but I knew his silence meant agreement. Their lies spread like wildfire, distorting the truth to save face. I sat in my apartment, the laptop screen illuminating my hands, my stomach churning with helplessness. Part of me wanted to burst into this discussion, to lay out the bills, to show how I'd single-handedly paid for half of their dream wedding, to tell how they demanded more, until I was at rock bottom, but I stopped myself. What was the point? They'd never admit they were wrong. Instead, I opened a new tab and typed in apartments in Asheville, North Carolina. I'd been there before, just passing through, the quiet mountains, the foggy mornings, the smell of pine trees, and the feeling that I could start over. I didn't need anything more, not their acceptance, not their home, just a new beginning. I called the realtor and heard my voice calm, even light, something small. I just need to start from scratch. That evening, there was a knock on the door. It was Nathan. His face was grim. His eyes full of worry. "They're trashing you online," he said, showing me Kevin's post on his phone, which had already garnered dozens of comments. "Are you okay?" I nodded, though my hands were shaking so badly the coffee cup clinked in my palms. "I'm done with them," I said. He didn't argue or persuade, he just sat next to me on the couch, silently, but in such a way that his presence warmed me more than any words. I packed boxes, stacked books, closed my laptop, and he was simply there. Before leaving, he said, "You're stronger than they think," and those words stayed with me. A small anchor in the storm in which my old life was crumbling. By midnight, I'd booked a one-way ticket to Asheville, and my fingers trembled as I pressed confirm, as if I were signing a contract with myself, promising never to return to a place where I'd been treated like a liability, like a burden. The flight was scheduled for the following week, and that time felt like an eternity, because every new day felt like walking on hot coals. Ruining the wedding was their choice, their conscience, their greed and arrogance, and the more I replayed it all, the more clearly I realized they'd hurt me too much, and there would be no turning back. Joyce's voicemail echoed in my head, her shrill accusations, her theatrical intonations, devoid of any pity, only contempt and fury. Jeffrey's cold tone echoed, his short, cutting "You're a disgrace to the family" as if carved in stone. But what crushed me most was Kevin's post, full of venom and lies, in which he painted me as a monster in front of my entire neighbors, the people I'd lived among for so many years. Every line of his accusations left a sting, and I found myself rereading them over and over again, as if trying to understand the moment my life had become a target for their hatred. I wasn't going to stay to fight their version of the truth, which had nothing to do with reality. I'd given them everything: money, energy, hope, time, and they'd thrown it all away like trash. Now I was choosing for myself, and for the first time in years, it felt like a breath of air after a long period of suffocation. A few weeks after the chaos, I stood in my tiny office, which had always seemed like a safe haven to me but now looked eerie and empty, packing the last of my things into boxes. Over the years, I built a small freelance marketing business, a side hustle that brought in just enough to keep me afloat, pay the rent, and indulge in the occasional little pleasure. It wasn't much: a rented room with peeling walls, a desk, a computer, and a few client files in plastic folders, but it was all mine, my own work, my pride. I decided to sell it, as if I were closing an old chapter. A local agency offered $25,000 for my client list and existing contracts. As I picked up the pen to sign the documents, my hand didn't shake. On the contrary, for the first time in a long time, I felt firm and confident. This money, along with the $10,000 I'd snatched from the wedding, became my ticket out, my ticket to freedom. But there was another step, far more difficult and painful. For years, I'd been investing in the family grocery store, first by creating a marketing campaign that literally saved it from closure, and then by pumping $5,000 of my own savings into it to keep it afloat. I managed inventory, negotiated with suppliers, monitored the balance sheet, and patched holes they hadn't even noticed, and all the while, I thought I was doing a good deed for my family. But after they unleashed all their hatred on me, I knew it was over. I contacted the bank and withdrew every penny of my deposits. I didn't call Joyce or Jeffrey to warn them. They had made their choice the night they told me to disappear, and I followed their instructions to the letter. now their store would have to exist without my support, and I knew how it would end. Without my money and my guidance, the cracks I'd spent years mending would become chasms. Towards the end of the month, I was sitting on a bus heading to Asheville, North Carolina. All my belongings fit in 2 suitcases, my clothes, my laptop, and a few books I couldn't leave behind. I looked out the window. And the mountains rose up beyond the glass, gray and majestic, their silent promise of a new beginning pulling me forward. I rented a small apartment downtown, nothing fancy, just a 1-bedroom with a view of the Blue Ridge Mountains. But as I sat on the bare floor that first evening, eating takeout from a cardboard box and gazing at the dark silhouettes of the mountains, I felt lighter than I had in years. All the horror was behind me. Joyce, Jeffrey, Kevin, and their anger, their voices, their accusations, now they were just echoes, gradually fading. The family store didn't last long after I left. Nathan sent me messages, short and sharp, each one a report of disaster. First, suppliers stopped delivering because payments were weeks late, then customers started leaving, disappointed by the empty shelves. Kevin, to whom they handed over the reins, made one clumsy decision after another, and every step he took led the store to ruin. Joyce tried to intervene, but she couldn't handle the logistics I'd spent years building. Jeffrey simply retreated, blaming everyone around him but himself. A few weeks later, they declared bankruptcy, and the shop's doors closed forever. In one of his messages, Nathan wrote, "They're falling apart without you." I read his words but didn't respond. Their failures were no longer my burden. In Asheville, I started over. I worked as a freelance marketer, taking small jobs from local shops, creating ads for coffee roasters and small boutiques, helping those who truly valued the work and paid for it with respect. The work brought stability and quiet satisfaction. My skills, honed over the years, were finally being put to use in a way that didn't make me feel exploited. At first, I kept to myself, cautiously approaching new people, as if still expecting a stab in the back, but gradually, the warmth of the city, its slow pace, the smiles of random passers-by, and the kind words of the shopkeepers began to draw me to a life I could call my own. One morning, I turned down a narrow street in the center of town, and my nose caught the aroma of fresh bread, so rich and sweet that my feet carried me to the low door with its bell. The small bakery turned out to be a warm refuge, and behind the counter stood a woman with a wide smile and a sparkle of laughter in her eyes. It was Shirley Bennett, in her 50s, her apron dusted with flour, and her laughter so infectious it filled the room and seemed to dispel even the most difficult thoughts. "You're new," she said, handing me a scone, warm and crumbly, across the counter. "The first treat is always free." We got to talking. I mentioned that I'd recently moved, but I didn't mention the exact events that led me here, and she, fortunately, didn't pry. Instead, Shirley shared her story, how, after a divorce, she was left alone with debt and fear, but found the strength to start over, opening a bakery that has now become a favorite spot for local residents. "Starting over is courage," she said, and her eyes held more understanding than I'd ever heard from my family in my entire life. She invited me to a meeting of local business owners and introduced me to people who immediately started asking for help with advertising. Thanks to her, I found 2 clients in just a week, and that was the beginning of my new journey. Shirley became more than an acquaintance. She became part of my morning rituals, when I'd come over for coffee and we'd discuss life, plans, and the little things that usually go unnoticed. Her constant presence was a quiet support I hadn't asked for, but needed. I hadn't heard from Joyce and Jeffrey at the time. They'd vanished from my life as abruptly as they'd once demanded my disappearance. Kevin, however, had sent me an angry letter one day, accusing me of ruining the family business. "You're selfish," he wrote, as if all my years of support and investment had simply not existed. I deleted his letter without even considering a response, knowing anything I might say would be wasted. Lindsay remained silent, likely caught up in his usual vortex of accusations. And then I remembered Nathan's words from Erie, "You're stronger than they think." He was right. In Asheville, I was no longer the shadow I'd been in Erie. I was building new connections with clients, friendships with people who accepted me for who I was, and a life that finally felt like my own. One evening, After the lights had gone out and the doors were closed at Shirley's bakery, she invited me to stay. We sat at a wooden table with mugs of hot tea, the sweet scent of cinnamon rolls filling the air. "You seem different," she remarked, watching me closely. I settled in and nodded, realizing I hadn't thought about Erie in days, not replaying their voices and accusations. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly free, as if I could finally breathe deeply without the weight of others' expectations. Asheville had become my new beginning, and with Shirley's help, I had found my place. I never looked back. Months later, Asheville had become my sanctuary, my city, where every day felt like a step closer to me, but echoes of Erie still lingered, because the world there was crumbling. The family grocery store, once the center of my parents' universe, was gone. His windows were shuttered, symbolizing their disintegration. Joyce and Jeffrey were faced with a harsh reality, their savings depleted. They had to sell the house we grew up in and move into a cramped apartment on the outskirts. Neighbors who used to smile at them on the street now avoided their gaze, their reputations crumbling along with the store. Kevin was no better off. His charm, once enough to fool everyone, couldn't hide his utter incompetence. He took a job at a hardware store, but customers whispered behind his back that he was the cause of the family's downfall. His arrogance no longer mattered. Lindsay, his fiancée, quietly removed her ring and vanished from his life, dissolving into tension, as if she had never existed. The life they had tried to build on my generosity and borrowed fame was shattered. I didn't dwell on their difficulties. Asheville became my center of attention, a place where I could recuperate without their shadows and reproaches. My small freelance marketing business began to grow. I signed contracts with 5 local businesses, a brewery, a bookstore, an art gallery, a cozy cafe, and a hiking gear store. My days were filled with creating logos, writing ad copy, and pitching campaigns over coffee in the bustling downtown coffee shops. I earned about $3,000 a month, enough to pay rent, buy groceries, and occasionally indulge in small pleasures like a concert ticket or a new pair of hiking boots. Each project was a building block in the foundation of the life I was now building for myself. Nathan still felt close, even from hundreds of miles away. He called every few weeks, his voice warm through the crackling line, like a hand on my shoulder. "It's not the same without you," he said one day, then laughed. "But it seems like you're doing just fine." His words warmed me and reminded me that I truly was stronger than I'd ever believed. He sent photos of his latest project, carved wooden signs, small but incredibly warm, each one seemingly filled with his hands and heart. I stared at them for a long time, running my fingers across the phone screen, smiling because I knew these simple souvenirs held so much more than just wood and varnish. They were a symbol of our friendship, one that had endured distance and silence. His care reminded me of the strength I'd once almost lost, the inner core I'd so often hidden, catering to others' expectations. Of course, Shirley became my main anchor in Asheville. Her bakery, with its cozy wooden tables and the smell of freshly baked bread, wasn't just a place to grab a bite or a coffee, but also a place to recharge, to come up with ideas for work, to rest my soul after long, stressful days. Sometimes she'd slip me a cupcake with a warm smile, fuel for work, and I'd laugh, realizing that behind those words lay her simple, yet so profound, faith in me, her confidence that I could handle it, that I was worth something, helped me see myself as a woman who wasn't limited to being a daughter, perpetually failing to live up to everyone else's expectations. And just when I began to truly feel like I'd found my way, a letter arrived from Joyce. It was a clear morning, the sun streaming through the blinds, and I immediately recognized her handwriting, uneven, shaky, as if each letter were labored. In the letter, she wrote of being diagnosed with a serious illness, begging me to return to Erie, asking for help in healing her and Jeffrey from their losses. Every line was drenched in guilt, every phrase portraying me as the only key to their salvation. I read the letter twice, and each time, my chest tightened. My stomach clenched with pain and familiar anxiety. Shirley, wiping the counter, noticed my expression. "What's wrong, dear?" she asked, her voice quiet but confident. I handed her the letter. She read it carefully, her brow furrowed, then set it aside. "This smacks of manipulation," she said sharply but fairly. "People don't change overnight." her directness, clear and firm, seemed to clear the fog in my head. I already knew Joyce's tactics: tears, pity, pulling at my most sensitive nerves. I called Nathan to hear his perspective. He was silent for a few seconds, then said, "She's trying to drag you back, Tiffany. Don't give in. Don't let them pull you back into their chaos." His voice, warm and confident, sounded like confirmation of what I already felt inside. I didn't give in. I wrote a short and final reply: "I wish you all the best, but I'm not coming back." I sent the letter by email and, with a heavy heart, blocked all their numbers. It was difficult. Part of me still longed for the family I'd always dreamed of having, but I knew the reality was different. If I allowed myself to become attached to their pain again, I would destroy the fragile world I'd built here in Asheville. When I shared this with Shirley, she merely nodded, her eyes shining with pride. "You choose yourself," she said, pouring me fresh coffee. "That's the hardest and bravest thing." In the next call, Nathan repeated her words almost verbatim: "You're free now, don't look back." Their support, so constant and genuine, became my shield, and it was this support that gave me the courage to finally let go of the past. In Asheville, I wasn't just building a career, I was building a life. I joined a hiking group and began hiking trails where the Black Balsam Knob Mountains revealed themselves in all their wild beauty, stretching to the horizon, and I felt my heart expand with the endless landscape. I picked up brushes and watercolors again, a hobby I had abandoned back in Erie, and my sketchbooks began to fill with landscapes shimmering with soft colors. My apartment finally felt like home. Plants lined the windowsills, a rug I'd bought at a local market, and the shelves were adorned with books I'd not only purchased but also read. My business was growing. I'd signed a major contract with the Regional Tourism Board, and this 6-month campaign doubled my income. The work was challenging, with nights sometimes spent reworking copy and searching for the right slogan. But each day was proof of my worth, a confirmation that I could do it myself. One evening, sitting in Shirley's bakery with Shirley and several of her regulars, I laughed as I listened to stories about Asheville's most unusual festivals. Just then, the owner of the small shop approached me and thanked me for the advertising campaign that had increased his business. I smiled, and a warmth spread through my chest, a warmth I'd never experienced in Erie. And then I realized the most important lesson. My worth was never determined by what I did for Joyce, Jeffrey, or Kevin. It was in the life I created for myself, in the clients who trusted me, in the friends who supported me, and in the quiet moments when I felt whole. Asheville wasn't just a new beginning, it was where I learned to stand tall, not for someone else, but for myself.